In the year 1265, one of the greatest books of theology completed by one of the greatest theologians to walk the face of the earth was completed. The title of the book is the Summa Contra Gentiles. It was imagined as a complete book of apologetics, establishing the rational basis of the Catholic faith, specifically written to refute Jews, Muslims, heretics, and others. This work has been constantly used throughout the history of the Church for the education of seminarians. Its arguments have been repeated generation after generation, and a number of popes have drawn from this work to illustrate their teaching, including by Pope Francis on a number of occasions. There was even an extensive commentary written on this work by Sylvester Ferrara, the head of the Dominican order from 1525 to 1528, and an adaptation was made by Savonarola, a controversial Florentine Dominican preacher. Yet, on the internet, the Summa Contra Gentiles has become famous for a certain argument that it gives against Islam in the beginning of the first book. In some cases, it is represented appropriately, yet in a less detailed manner, but in many cases, it is represented in a completely insufficient way, even by Catholic apologists. For those who are not aware of this section from Summa Contra Gentiles, it is found in the 6th chapter of the first book. Here's the passage that has sparked so much controversy. St. Thomas writes about Muhammad, quote, "Muhammad enticed peoples with the promise of carnal pleasures, to the desire of which the concupiscence of the flesh instigates. He also delivered commandments in keeping with his promises, by giving the reins to carnal pleasure, in which it is easy for carnal men to obey. Also the lessons of truth which he inculcated were only such as can be easily known to any man of average wisdom by his natural powers. In fact, he mingled the truths which he taught with many fables and many false doctrines, nor did he add any signs of supernatural agency, which alone are a fitting witness to divine inspiration, since a visible work that can only be from God proves the teacher of truth to be invisibly inspired. But he asserted that he was sent in the power of arms, which sign is not lacking even to robbers and tyrants. Again, those who believed in him from the outset were not wise men practiced in things divine and human, but bestial men who dwelt in the deserts, utterly ignorant of all divine teaching. And it was by a multitude of such men, in the force of arms, that he compelled others to submit to his law. Lastly, no divine oracles of prophets in a previous age bore witness to him. Rather, he corrupted almost all the teachings of the New Testaments by a narrative replete with fables, as one may see by a perusal of his law. Hence, by a cunning device, he did not commit the reading of the Old and New Testament books to his followers, lest he should thereby be convicted of falsehood. Thus it is evident that those who believe in his words believe lightly." End quote. Many take issue with what St. Thomas says here on two grounds. First, on a matter of fact, whether it is true that Muhammad acted in such a manner, taught such things, and his religion was spread in this way. And second, on a matter of principle, whether such an argument is even a compelling argument against Islam, even if we were to concede what St. Thomas says as a matter of fact. In order to understand how neither of these two arguments against St. Thomas is valid, we ought to first understand the general purpose of St. Thomas. Then step by step we can descend into particular questions. But before I begin, I want to clarify the purpose of this video. I'm not an expert on Islam, nor have I ever pretended to be such. So this video isn't directly and immediately intended to be an apologetic video against Islam. If such was the case, you would expect me to quote extensively from Muslim scholars and provide a more robust description of various schools of thought within Islam. Rather, this is an apologetic video defending St. Thomas, clarifying the thrust of his argument. It is in the teaching of St. Thomas, and especially his teaching on divine revelation, that I've dedicated many hours of study on, and it is this that I will present. Thus, even while many of you may disagree with what St. Thomas says here, you can understand that many of the presentations of his doctrine have been deficient. This will allow those of you listening to better understand the teachings of the Catholic Church, especially presented in the First Vatican Council, on the nature of revelation and the proper procedure in Catholic apologetics. Anyways, let's get into it. Before we can understand St. Thomas's argument, we need to grasp the fundamental problem he's addressing. How can we verify that someone claiming to speak for God actually does so? This isn't just about Islam. It's about the rational basis for accepting any claim to divine revelation without falling into various vices against faith. In order to understand his teaching, you must first understand the problem that is encountered when we even think of the idea of God revealing his will to mankind. This problem is how we are to verify that it is from God. Think about it this way. It would be obviously foolish if someone were to preach to you saying that he is from God, and then you simply trust that he is from God, without any sort of sign from God that he is truly a divine messenger. In Catholicism, we call this the vice of credulity, and the person who suffers from this vice is called credulous. It is someone who is willing to believe quickly in important things on little grounds. For example, let's say you had a situation where a random person calls your phone and says they are from the government and you need to send them a large amount of money. If you are to believe them at their word without any sort of verification, you would be a credulous person. The same principle applies to religious claims, but with infinitely higher stakes. Thus, when St. Thomas comments on the low moral quality of those who affirm the message of Muhammad, saying that, quote, "those who believe his words believe lightly," he is taking the position that there were not adequate signs that verified that Muhammad was from God. The rest of St. Thomas's discourse is going to be concerned with supporting this position, that the proper signs which would bring about the ascent of faith were not present among the followers of Muhammad. So in summary, there is a vice called credulity, which concerns those who believe important things on light grounds. This is not something unique to Muslims, and may not even be present in all Muslims subjectively. But St. Thomas's claim is that this is the objective circumstances when one actually looks at the objective grounds that are present in the origination and spread of Islam. Interestingly, this is a vice that is rebuked in many places in Islamic sources as well. In fact, there's a recurring theme throughout the Quran of various people groups who choose not to listen to the preaching of Islam because their fathers worshipped in a certain way. These individuals are rebuked for believing in religion on insufficient grounds. They are rebuked for their credulity. So there's actually common ground here between Catholic and Islamic thought on the necessity for proper verification. St. Thomas distinguishes between negative signs, which remove obstacles to belief, and positive signs, which actually prove divine origin. Let's first examine the negative signs, the things that would disqualify a claimed revelation if present, before moving on to positive signs. In divine matters, where we have someone who is a prophet of God claiming to bring a message that can mean the difference between eternal bliss and eternal punishment, how are we to determine whether the person is from God or not? Well, there are actually quite a few different ways. First, there can be certain negative signs, and second, there can be certain positive signs. The negative signs are those which remove obstacles to unbelief, whereas the positive signs present us with actual signs that this is something which we ought to believe. Think about it this way. If someone were to consider whether Catholicism contradicts natural reason, this would be a negative sign. Just because something doesn't contradict natural reason doesn't mean that it is truly from God. Men guided by natural reason can teach a doctrine that is not in contradiction to natural reason. Yet, if it does contradict natural reason, then we can be sure that it is not from God. Hence, it gives negative certitude rather than positive certitude. On the other hand, a positive sign is something extrinsic to the teaching, which is from God, and confirms the teaching. Thus, for example, if God were to work a miracle by the hand of a prophet, it would be a confirmation by God that the doctrine is true. Since God can neither deceive nor be deceived, it is clear that whatever he supports is true. Now, when it comes to negative signs, these can come in two kinds. First, we can ask whether the doctrine contradicts natural reason, and second, we can ask whether this doctrine contradicts previous divine revelation. When it comes to natural reason, St. Thomas makes two distinct claims based on the two ways in which we can come to know something in the natural order. We can either perceive the intrinsic agreement between something and natural reason directly and by our own reason, or on the other hand, we can conjecture that something is true and the opposite is false from the witness of many wise men. When those who are wise and learned in such matters do not accept the teaching of such a prophet, this is a sign that it may contradict natural reason, since they will be able to perceive its discordance with natural reason. As to the first kind of agreement based on our own reason, St. Thomas comments that Muhammad, quote, mingled the truths which he taught with many fables and most false doctrines, end quote. As to the second kind of agreement based on extrinsic evidence, he comments that those who accepted it were, quote, bestial men who dwelt in the deserts, utterly ignorant of all divine teaching, end quote, and that those who accepted the teaching, quote, were not wise men practiced in things divine and human, end quote. Hence, he argues that the doctrine of Muhammad was devoid of the witness of many wise men, due to the intellectual abilities of the first followers of Islam. Here we may excuse St. Thomas on this point, for it is simply not historically true that there were not any such wise men who believed Muhammad from the beginning, as is evident from figures like Ali. Yet this comment from St. Thomas does not come from malice or prejudice, but from a lack of resources on the early history of Islam, and some of the learned jurists and philosophers produced among the early converts to Islam. Yet it ought to be clearly stated that this does not provide positive proof of Islam, since this is merely a negative sign, which, as we discussed above, simply removes obstacles and does not provide a proper sign from God. Besides being consistent with reason, any true revelation must also be consistent with any previous revelation. As is obvious, God cannot contradict himself. Thus, if there is previous revelation that is confirmed, any future claims to revelation that contradict it will be false. St. Thomas states that Islam is contrary to both the Old and New Testaments, stating that, quote, he corrupted almost all the teachings of the Old and New Testaments by a narrative replete with fables, as one may see by a perusal of his law, end quote. He further confirms this comment by stating that, quote, by a cunning device, he did not commit the reading of the Old and New Testament books to his followers, lest he should thereby be convicted of falsehood, end quote. Yet there is an objection here. Muslims do not accept the Old and New Testaments as divine revelation. Thus, this argument does not seem to follow. We can answer this objection on two grounds. One which is more in line with the matter itself, and the other which is more in line with the intent of St. Thomas. First, some may argue on the basis of what they call the Islamic dilemma. The Islamic dilemma quotes certain parts of the Quran which seem to affirm the fact that the Torah and Gospels are divinely revealed. This seems to be the case due to the fact that such appeals were made to Jews and Christians who would have possessed these books. Yet it is not the intent of this video to adjudicate on this matter, since this response does not seem to be in line with the intent of St. Thomas. For earlier, St. Thomas had stated, quote, the Muslims do not agree with us as to the authority of any scripture by which they may be convicted in the same way as we are able to dispute with the Jews by means of the Old Testament, and with the heretics by means of the New. But the former accept neither. Thus we need to have recourse to natural reason, to which all are compelled to assent, end quote. So did St. Thomas contradict himself? No. Rather, St. Thomas here was simply using the Old and New Testaments as reliable historical artifacts of previous revelation, not as endowed with divine authority. St. Thomas seeks to refute Islam on the basis that the history told in the Bible is reliable. Thus, if Islam contradicts this history, then this is a point where Islam is refuted. In a similar way, if we assumed, for the sake of argument, that Islam made the claim that Julius Caesar never engaged in war, we could use his work Gallic Wars as a reliable historical source to refute this. In the same way, we are free to use the New Testaments without supposing their divine authority. So, while St. Thomas did not immediately intend to refute Islam on the basis of previous supernatural revelation, those who affirm the validity of the Islamic dilemma can easily adapt his argument in that way. In summary, the first way we can consider whether something is divine is by considering whether it contradicts something else we know to be true, whether by reason or by revelation. St. Thomas claims that Islam contradicts reason, which is evident on both intrinsic grounds from falsehoods present and extrinsic grounds from the lack of wise men in presence of unwise men among the original converts of Muhammad. Further, he claims that Islam contradicts revelation, which is evident from the contradictions between the teachings of Muhammad in the Old and New Testaments, which is confirmed from the fact that Muhammad did not allow his followers to read the Old and New Testaments. Having examined what would disqualify revelation, we now turn to what would positively prove divine origin. St. Thomas identifies several types of positive signs and argues that Islam lacks all of them, while Christianity possesses them in abundance. If you remember from above, there's a distinction between negative and positive signs. Negative signs argue that there is not a contradiction between a certain revelation and either reason or another revelation. This does not positively prove that a religion is from God, but can prove that a religion is not from God if it contradicts known truth. Now, when it comes to positive signs, these are meant to confirm that a certain religion is from God. These positive signs can either be interior to the message or exterior to the message. Something which is interior to the message would be, for example, the sublimity of the doctrine that is preached. When it comes to those that are interior, Islam frequently uses this as a test of the divine origins of the Quran. St. Thomas contends that, rather than being sublime, the true teachings that are present in Islam, quote, were only such as can be easily known to any man of average wisdom by his natural powers, end quote. Something that is exterior to the doctrine would be, for example, certain miracles or prophecies that it could only come from God. As to prophecies, St. Thomas denies that there were any prophets who prophesied of Muhammad. He writes, quote, no divine oracles of prophets in any previous age bore witness to him, end quote. Further, he also denies that there were any miracles. These miracles can be of two sorts. First, moral miracles, such as the rapid conversion of many to the true faith against all odds. Second, physical miracles, such as the raising from the dead. As to physical miracles, St. Thomas denies that Muhammad had any physical miracles, writing, quote, nor did he add any signs of supernatural agency, which alone are a fitting witness to divine inspiration, since a visible work that can only be from God proves the teacher of truth to be invisibly inspired." End quote. Yet the most important reflection from St. Thomas and the Fathers as a whole comes from the moral miracles. For St. Thomas, this is the most important of all the miracles, since this is broad and evident, whereas many miracles can be difficult to verify, especially in the pre-modern world. This is a classic proof given by Catholic apologists, that the spread of Christianity could not be reasonably chalked up to natural causes for a number of different reasons. The teaching was contrary to man's passions, teaching them to restrain rather than indulge their passions. There were extrinsic factors that attempted to destroy Christianity, namely the Roman Empire. Due to all these factors, there is no natural explanation for the success of Christianity, but it can only be explained by the hand of God. But someone may object that, just like Catholicism, Islam had a rapid expansion as well. St. Thomas responded by denying that such a moral miracle is present in Islam, explaining that the rapid expansion of Islam cannot be used as an argument of its divine origins, since it can be chalked up to natural explanations. He invokes three specific natural causes. First, whereas Christianity promised spiritual goods, Islam promised carnal goods. Quote, "Muhammad enticed peoples with a promise of carnal pleasure, to the desire of which the concupiscence of the flesh instigates." End quote. Second, whereas Christianity gave stringent commandments to deny the flesh, Islam gave commandments which entice the flesh. Muhammad, quote, "delivered commandments in keeping with his promises, by giving the reins to carnal pleasures, in which it is easy for carnal men to obey." End quote. Thus, on these two grounds, St. Thomas states that there is a perfectly natural explanation for the spread of Islam. People are often addicted to and drawn to carnal pleasure. So if there is a prophet that comes and preaches this doctrine, then it is to be expected that people will come with an open ear. As an analogous explanation, you do not need to give a supernatural explanation for why the sexual revolution became so popular, but you would need one if suddenly chastity spread across a sexually degenerate people like wildfire. Third, whereas Christianity spread in the face of death and persecution, Islam spread by the sword. Quote, "He asserted that he was sent in the power of arms, which sign is not lacking even to robbers and tyrants." End quote. And, quote, "It was by a multitude of such men in the force of arms that he compelled others to submit to his law." End quote. In summary, besides the negative signs given above, there are also positive signs. These positive signs can either be internal, such as the sublimity of the doctrine, or external, which are either miracles or prophecies. Further, we can consider miracles either as individual miracles or as miracles in the spread of the religion. St. Thomas argues that Islam lacks all the positive signs of divine revelation: no sublime doctrine beyond natural reason, no prophetic testimony, no miracles, and a pattern of spread that can be explained entirely through natural human motivations and military force. This all becomes very clear, and the outline of a convincing apologetic for Catholicism becomes clear when we compare the statement he made in defense of Catholicism with the statements he made in order to refute Islam. First, whereas St. Thomas states that Islam does not have confirming signs of miracles, on the other hand, it is true of Catholicism that, quote, "Divine wisdom himself, who knows all things most fully, deigned to reveal to man the secrets of God's wisdom, and by suitable arguments proves his presence, and the truth of his doctrine and inspiration, by performing works surpassing the capability of the whole of nature, namely, the wondrous healing of the sick, the raising of the dead to life, a marvelous control over the heavenly bodies, and, what excites yet more wonder, the inspiration of human minds, so that unlettered and simple persons are filled with the Holy Spirit, and in one instant are endowed with the most sublime wisdom and eloquence." End quote. Second, whereas St. Thomas states that the spread of Islam can be explained by natural circumstances, such as the teaching drawing by promising carnal delights and spreading by arms, on the other hand, it is true of Catholicism that, quote, "convinced by the strength of the proof, and not by the force of arms, nor by the promise of delights, but, and this is the greatest marvel of all, amidst the tyranny of persecutions, a countless crowd of not only simple, but also of the wisest men, embrace the Christian faith, which inculcates things surpassing all human understanding, curbs the pleasures of the flesh, and teaches contempt of all worldly things. That the minds of mortal beings should assent to such things is both the greatest of miracles and the evident work of divine inspiration, seeing that they despise visible things and desire only those that are invisible." End quote. Third, whereas St. Thomas states that Islam was not prophesied, on the other hand, it is true of Catholicism that, quote, "and that this happens not suddenly nor by chance, but by the disposition of God, is shown by the fact that God foretold that he would do so by the manifold oracles of the prophets, whose books we have in veneration as bearing witness to our faith." End quote. Fourth, whereas according to St. Thomas, Islam is devoid of miracles, on the other hand, Catholicism has miracles which verify her claims in every generation, which is evident from the rapid expansion of Catholicism. He writes, quote, "Now such a wondrous conversion of the world to the Christian faith is a most indubitable proof that such signs did take place, so that there is no need to repeat them, when they are so evidently apparent from their effect. For it would be the most wondrous sign of all, if, without any wondrous signs, the world were persuaded by simple and lowly men to believe things so arduous, to accomplish things so difficult, and to hope for things so sublime, although even in our time, God does not cease to work miracles through his saints in confirmation of the faith." End quote. In summary, according to St. Thomas, when we compare the religions of Catholicism and Islam from the perspective of the motives of credibility, Catholicism clearly surpasses Islam in its divine origins. Through direct comparison, St. Thomas argues that Catholicism possesses all the signs of the divine revelation that Islam lacks: confirmed miracles, supernatural spread against all natural odds, prophetic testimony, and continuing miraculous confirmation.